Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're zooming in on something that's definitely on a lot of people's minds, especially if you're watching the Vancouver real estate scene, the Canadian dollar. You actually sent us some really interesting material looking into what happens when, our loonie gets stronger.
That's right.
So that's exactly what we're digging into today. We really want to see if history can give us any clues specifically for Vancouver.
Yeah, it's like a little historical detective job, isn't it? We're looking at this relationship between a rising Canadian dollar and Vancouver home prices. We're focusing mainly on the last, 30 years? Roughly 1995 to now, based on one of the sources you shared.
Right.
And the goal really is to kind of unpack the complexities, see if there are real patterns there, beyond just the headlines.
Okay, so let's kick things off just to make sure we're all on the same page. What does it actually mean when we say the Canadian dollar is rising? For someone maybe not watching exchange rates every day?
Right. Good question. Think of it this way. When our dollar rises, it gets more valuable compared to other currencies. The big one we usually track is the U.S. dollar.
Okay.
So we look at the USD CAD exchange rate. If that number goes down, like one source mentioned it going from 1.57 down to 1.07, that means one Canadian dollar buys more U.S. dollars.
Gotcha.
So yeah, a lower USD CAD number, that's our signal the loonie's getting stronger.
Okay, so a lower number means a stronger loonie. Now, the stuff we looked at, it highlighted some specific times over the last 30 years when the dollar really did strengthen quite a bit. What did the history books, the data, tell us about Vancouver housing prices during those specific periods?
Well, yeah, the data points to two really key stretches.
Yeah.
The first one was between 2002 and 2007.
Okay.
And during that time, the USD CAD rate, it dropped pretty significantly. Like we said, from around 1.57 all the way down near 1.07.
Wow, that's quite a drop.
It is. And what's super interesting is that this period, it lined up almost perfectly with a massive boom in Vancouver's housing market.
A boom. Okay.
Yeah, like serious price growth. The source you sent even gave an example, like a property going from maybe CAD 600,000 up to $1 million.
In just 5 years.
Roughly, yeah. It's kind of wild to think about those jumps back then. Puts today's market in perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. So dollar gets stronger, Vancouver prices take off. Seems like a link there.
It certainly suggests something, yeah, a correlation at least. And then the second big period was 2009 to 2011.
Right after the financial crisis.
Exactly. So after that global mess in 2008, 2009, the Canadian dollar started climbing again. The USD CAD rate fell from about 1.14 down towards 0.99, parity almost.
Okay.
And guess what? That was when Vancouver home prices not only recovered from the crisis dip, but they kept going up. The data suggests they hit around CAD 1.4 million by 2011.
So there it is again. Stronger dollar, rising Vancouver home prices. It really feels like they're, dancing together or something.
Moving in tandem, it seems.
But what about the flip side? When the Canadian dollar was maybe just treading water or even got weaker, did housing prices do the opposite?
That's a crucial part of the picture. And the sources did look at that. Take the period from 1994 to 2001.
Okay, what happened then?
Well, the data indicates Vancouver home prices actually decreased then by about 17 or 18%.
Decreased. Wow.
Yeah. And that period lines up with a Canadian dollar that was, fairly stable, maybe leaning a bit weaker.
Interesting.
And if you go back even further, like the early 80s, say 81 to 86, a weaker Canadian dollar then coincided with a pretty flat housing market in Vancouver. Not much happening price-wise.
Okay, so periods of strength match rising prices, periods of weakness or stability match falling or flat prices. It's starting to look like more than just coincidence, maybe?
It definitely strengthens the case for some kind of relationship, yeah.
So why? Let's put on our detective hats, like you said. What are the possible reasons? Why might a stronger Canadian dollar push Vancouver housing prices up?
Right. This is the big question, the why. And the sources float a few ideas. One major angle is foreign buyers.
Okay, how so?
Well, if the Canadian dollar is strong, our real estate becomes more expensive for anyone buying with, say, U.S. dollars or other currency.
Right, basic math.
Exactly. So theory says that could cool demand from overseas buyers. But, and this is a big but for Vancouver.
There's always a but with Vancouver real estate.
Yeah. The sources point out Vancouver's reputation, right? It's seen globally as a stable, desirable place to park money, especially from Asia, a safe haven. So for those buyers, maybe the price sensitivity due to currency isn't as high. They might buy anyway, even if it costs more in their home currency. That could partly explain why prices still rose even when the CAD was strong.
That makes sense. That global appeal might just sort of buffer the currency effect a bit. What else could be going on?
Another angle is construction costs, specifically imported materials. A stronger dollar makes importing stuff cheaper, right? So things like building materials from the U.S. or elsewhere could cost less.
So maybe that helps build more houses, keep prices down.
Well, in theory, it could lower construction costs, maybe encourage more supply. But again, the sources add a really important Vancouver-specific point here.
Which is?
Land scarcity and regulations. Even if materials get a bit cheaper, building anything new in Vancouver is still incredibly constrained by the lack of land and, all the zoning and permits.
Right. Cheaper drywall doesn't create more land or speed up approvals.
Exactly. So that potential cost saving might not actually translate into a flood of new homes hitting the market. The impact might be pretty limited there.
Okay. So foreign buyers might not be deterred, and cheaper materials don't necessarily mean much more supply. What about Canadians? People earning Canadian dollars, how does a stronger loonie affect them?
For domestic buyers, yeah, a stronger dollar generally means their money goes further for imported goods and services. While housing itself is priced in CAD, a stronger overall economy, which sometimes goes hand in hand with a stronger dollar, could maybe boost confidence. People feel better about the economy, maybe more willing to take on a big mortgage. It's a bit indirect, but it could support domestic demand.
Got it. So several potential links: foreign buyers, maybe construction costs a tiny bit, domestic confidence.
Yeah.
But the sources were pretty clear. This isn't happening in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Right? Other big things are always going on.
Oh, absolutely. You can't look at the dollar in isolation. The sources hammer this home. Think about those periods we discussed.
Like the early 2000s boom.
Exactly. 2001 to 2008, interest rates were really low. That was huge fuel for the housing market everywhere, not just Vancouver. Made borrowing cheap.
Right, cheap money.
Then you had the economic recovery after 9/11, boosting confidence. On the flip side, the 2008-2009 global financial crisis caused that temporary price dip, completely separate from whatever the CAD was doing right at that moment.
Yeah.
And then there are the ongoing factors, always influencing Vancouver. The amount of foreign investment coming in, population growth, immigration. These are always part of the mix.
So it's this complex soup of factors. The Canadian dollar is definitely an ingredient, maybe a key one sometimes, but it's not the whole recipe.
That's a perfect way to put it, yeah.
Okay, so let's fast forward. Bring it up to today, or very recently, April 2025. We've actually seen the Canadian dollar make a bit of a move lately. What's the story there?
Yes, that Financial Post article you sent highlighted that. The loonie recently nudged above 71 cents U.S.
Which it hadn't done for a while, right?
Not since early December last year, according to the article. And a big reason for this recent strength seems to be actually weakness in the U.S. dollar.
So it's relative.
Very much so. The weakness in the U.S. dollar is linked to ongoing uncertainty around U.S. trade policy. The article even mentions the U.S. dollar index, which tracks it against other world currencies, was down quite a bit, like 7.7% since mid-January.
And why the weaker U.S. dollar? What's driving that?
The article points to a couple of things. First, maybe a more, let's say, measured look at the risks still out there for the U.S. and global economies, maybe after some earlier optimism about tariffs changing.
Okay.
And second, the odds seem to be increasing that the U.S. Federal Reserve might cut interest rates soon. And expectations of rate cuts usually push a currency's value down.
Interesting. So our dollar's recent little pop is tied pretty closely to these bigger U.S. and global shifts. But what are the experts predicting for the loonie going forward? Does the article give any sense of that?
It does. And actually, you get kind of different takes, which is, well, pretty typical for currency forecasts.
Oh, right. Never easy.
So you have an analyst from CIBC Capital Markets, Noah Buffum, who expects the Canadian dollar to actually underperform other currencies against the U.S. dollar as the year goes on.
Okay, so maybe slip back.
That's the suggestion. But then you have Stephen Brown from Capital Economics, who sees it differently. He's pointing to maybe slowing Canadian GDP growth and rising inflation here at home.
Which could mean
the Bank of Canada might need to cut our interest rates further. And if that happens, it would likely weaken the loonie, maybe even push it back below 70 cents U.S.
So conflicting forecasts. One sees underperformance, the other sees potential weakening due to our own economy and potential Bank of Canada moves. Really highlights the uncertainty.
Exactly. It's not just about the U.S. dollar. Our own economic situation plays a huge role.
Okay, so this brings us right to the core of it, and I know this is probably what our listeners who sent the sources are really thinking about, especially mentioning that idea of a Vancouver housing rebound in 2026. How does this recent, maybe temporary CAD strength and these uncertain future outlooks, how does that connect to Vancouver housing? Short term, medium term, maybe longer term?
Right, and this is where we have to be super careful because predicting housing prices is, well, notoriously tricky.
Understatement of the year.
Yeah, but okay, let's try to connect the dots based only on what we've discussed. If we just look at that historical pattern, stronger CADs, sometimes aligning with higher Vancouver prices, then this recent little bump in the loonie could maybe, in the very short term, add a tiny bit of upward pressure, but...
Big but again?
Big but. We immediately have to weigh that against those expert forecasts we just mentioned, suggesting the dollar might actually weaken later this year because of Canadian factors' slow growth, potential BOPA 2 cuts.
Right.
So any tiny boost from the recent CAD strength might be pretty short-lived, if it even happens.
Okay, so short term, maybe a tiny nudge up, but very uncertain and potentially temporary. What about the medium term, thinking out towards, say, 2026, like the listener mentioned?
Medium term gets even muddier. You've got these conflicting signals, right? The historical pattern suggests strength could support prices, but the current economic forecast for Canada suggests the dollar might actually weaken.
Okay.
And crucially, we absolutely have to remember all those other drivers. Where are interest rates going? How's the overall economy doing here and globally? Any big policy changes on housing? Global events?
Right. All the other soup ingredients?
Yeah, exactly. All those things will play a massive role. So trying to predict a 2026 rebound based just on where the Canadian dollar is today or where it might go, it's just, it's not really reliable. Way too simplistic.
Makes sense. Too many moving parts. And longer term?
Even more so. Long term, you're looking at fundamental drivers. Population trends, immigration levels over years, how much housing actually gets built over the long haul, big shifts in the global economy. The historical link between the CAD and housing is interesting. It's a data point, but it's just one thread in a huge, complex tapestry.
And the sources we looked at, they didn't specifically predict a 2026 rebound, did they?
No, they didn't make specific future year predictions like that. They were focused on explaining the historical relationship and the current dynamics. So any expectation for 2026 needs to be seen in a much wider context.
Okay, so pulling it all together from this deep dive, what's the main takeaway on this whole Canadian dollar and Vancouver real estate connection?
I'd say the key thing is, yes, the historical data, especially over the last 30 years, does show a correlation. Periods where the Canadian dollar rose significantly, like 2002, 2007, 2009, 2011, did coincide with big price increases in Vancouver.
And it feels like there's always but it's not a simple cause and effect, right?
Yeah.
Like dollar up doesn't automatically mean housing up.
Exactly right. It's way more complex. That relationship is tangled up with so many other major economic forces. Interest rates are huge, economic growth is huge, foreign investment levels matter a lot. Currency shifts are definitely something to watch, for sure, but they're not a magic predictor for the housing market on their own. Not by a long shot.
And right now, even though the dollar saw little recent strength, its future path is uncertain, and so is the wider economy.
Precisely. Lots of question marks out there.
Okay, so thinking about that historical link, tangled as it is, and all these current uncertainties, what else might our listener or anyone watching this space maybe want to track? What other data points could give a clearer picture, potentially?
That's a great closing thought. Maybe digging deeper into what the forecasts are specifically for Bank of Canada interest rate moves. That's always critical for housing.
Good one.
Or perhaps trying to find more current data on foreign investment flows, specifically into Vancouver real estate, though that can be tricky to track accurately. Those could offer some additional insights beyond just the currency movements.
Interesting angles to explore. Well, thanks for unpacking all of that with me today.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating topic.